Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, revision videos, flashcards, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so I'm delighted to welcome my guest for this episode, Dr. Letisha Brown. Letisha, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Would you like to start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am Dr. Letisha Brown. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia. This is my second year in the sociology department there as an assistant professor. I earned my PhD and master's in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin and my bachelor's degree in Africana Studies from the University of Northern Colorado. My work largely focuses on issues of race and racism, and specifically I study representations of Black female athletes, athlete activism, social relationships in food, and Black girlhoods.
Thank you. Very varied kind of research. And before we get into that, I was quite interested in your kind of upbringing, because you've moved around quite a lot, haven't you, Letisha? Is that right?
I have a lot.
So Angolan heritage, but raised in the US. Is that right?
Yes. My mother was born in Angola, came to the US when she was around 14 years old. My dad lives in Denver, Colorado. He's lived there his whole life. I was born in Colorado and raised in Ohio, Kentucky, Washington State. Spent a lot of my childhood in Lisbon, Portugal, where my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, ran an orphanage for children who had been abandoned during the Angolan Civil War.
Wow. So I'm guessing you're fluent Portuguese as well?
You would think so, but no.
So let's go into your research then. So it's up to you where you want to start. Tell us something about your research and what it is that you focus on.
Yeah, so my current research agenda is focusing a lot on issues of racism in sport. I just this previous spring semester taught a new course that I created called Plantation Politics, the Black Sport Experience. And we dealt with a number of issues from stereotyping to discrimination to activism in the course to kind of help me structure my newest research project, which is focusing on the experiences of Black female sportswomen, of Black women athletes in general, thinking about how their activism is often obscured or ignored in favor of the work that Black sportsmen are doing. And also issues like gender verification and even drug testing in sport, and how it's really a kind of a different experience for Black sportswomen than Black sportsmen because of these like colonial legacies and controlling images of Black womanhood.
So what's the kind of, starting from the very basics, what are the kind of the obvious stereotypes that are often associated with?
Yeah, so when women became athletes in general, there was this idea that it was going to make them more masculine. But kind of in the West, we know that Black women in general have always been perceived as more masculine than white women. It was one of the tropes that kind of justified their exploitation in slavery. And then, of course, they're also being like sexually wanton. That way it could justify the continued rape of Black women and the utilization of their body for reproductive purposes. And these things kind of get reimagined in sports. And so you have these images of Black women as either being hypersexual or hypermasculinized. And if we think about the ways that Serena Williams, for instance, her
Yes.
body is constantly criticized, like either she's doping or she's a man, and these are just these reproductions of colonial thought. And it's disturbing and disgusting. I think it was Don Imus who said that Venus and Serena were better suited for National Geographic than Playboy.
It's interesting because as soon as you started talking, the instant thing that came into my head was the Williams sisters, actually,
Yeah,
and their portrayal and representation in the media is pretty shocking, isn't it?
it is. Even, in 2020, and they've been at it for so long, and still these tropes keep emerging.
I mean, I'm not sure about the US press, but there's even been some suggestions that they shouldn't be able to play against other women because of their biological advantage.
Exactly. And that's the constant conversation is this notion of an unfair advantage. But, race isn't biological, even though we understand that on the surface, it still gets reprised as though it is.
Hmm. So, why do you think that you said in comparison to black male sports stars,
Mhm.
what are the differences that you really notice there from your research?
Well, I mean, for Black men, being masculinized is a good thing, right? Like you
Yeah.
want to be seen as virile and hypermasculine when you're a man. It just makes you more of a man. And so when those stereotypes exist, it's just that, sport is the safe place for Black men to be men, right? Like we don't want to see an aggressive Black man out on the street because they're constantly viewed as a threat. But in the arena, on the pitch, on the field, on the court, like that's a good thing. And like that's the one space where they can operate safely. And so I think often of the Williams sisters, but then also about athletes like Castor Semenya, and even thinking about like Florence Griffith Joyner, who was a very, if you think about it, during her time on the field, like the long hair, the long nails, like ultra feminine, but there were constantly these critiques of her body as well. Like it was too masculine, even under the guys. And it was like she was trying to exert a femininity that wasn't already there. Like it was a play. And it really fascinates me.
Hmm. Obviously, it is because your research suggests. But is this something that happens to all women within sports, or is it particularly dominant within black females?
I think to an extent, the masculinization happens to all women, but there's an expectation that Black women are more masculine. It's not a case of maybe this will happen. This is the fact. Black women are more masculine, whereas white women who play sports are not necessarily seen as such. Because, especially in sports like gymnastics, for instance, where even though now, like the ideal gymnast body is changing from what it was even 20 years ago,
Yeah.
from like slender and lithe to more masculine and compact. And it's interesting in the ways in which discourses over appropriateness within certain sports. If we think about figure skating, which is one in which women are, the expectation is that they are very elegant. But then you have, the French athlete, the wonderful French athlete who could do backflips and nobody else could. And it was very upsetting for the world that this Black French woman was able to do something that no other body on the ice rink could do. And it was a disaster for her. They even like made the move illegal, but she would do it anyway because she could. She had the power to do so.
Yeah. And I was interested at the other end, if you said as well as the masculinization, the sexualization. Maybe
Right.
I could ask you the same again. Are not all female stars actually sexualized to some degree? But you would say that it's more noticeable within the black female
And I
sport.
would say that it's different, right? So like
Yeah.
there's this expectation, especially if you think about like the WNBA, the expectation is that every person in the WNBA is a lesbian.
Mm.
And especially if they're Black. And so like the WNBA has done all of these campaigns in which they're showing their athletes as mothers or as wives to men, which kind of like implies that there's something wrong with being a lesbian. And it's really just fascinating the way that race kind of conflates our ideas about appropriate gender and sexuality.
Yeah, I was trying to think of, maybe you could help me out. Is there any kind of positive representation of black females within sport who don't follow those narratives?
Mm. I would really I really want to say yes, but for black women, it's one thing or another. Like if you're not being hyper masculinized, then there's something wrong with you because of your hair, or there's something wrong with you because you must, be using drugs in order to be as good as you are, or you're too angry. Like Serena Williams is often talked about as being too aggressive and too angry, even though her behaviors are no different and even to an extent lesser than what her male white counterparts do. But she is the one that gets fined the most, and she is the one that has the most negative media representation. And it's just a reproduction of these narratives about Black women as being more masculine and aggressive.
Why are we not moving away from this, Letitia? We're talking,
Yeah,
at this time, you would have thought that we've moved away from these stereotypes, from these judgments, but they continue and persist continually. Why do you think that is?
they do. It's easy. It's easier just to have these reproductions and like, Black women challenge these stereotypes. Like that's what Black feminism is about challenging these tropes that exist. But Black feminists, as artists, as scholars, as educators, are marginalized. And so the work that we do isn't as mainstream as these negative stereotypes.
And I was interested because on your Twitter feed, you do describe yourself as a black feminist. I've increasingly heard people use the term intersectional or something different than black feminism. But
Mm-hmm.
where do you stand on that argument? Because you describe yourself as a black feminist.
Yes, I mean, I think for me, my Black feminism grew out of my love of literature written by Black women, about and by for Black women, and kind of these ways in which we're able to name ourselves and not be named by the world around us, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about like the Combahee River Collective and going back to the roots of Black feminism, it's tied to intersectionality and understanding that race, gender, class, sexuality, heterosexism, they cannot be, separated. We can't understand them as individual categories because it's more than just categorization, right? It's our lived experiences, and we live lives that are intersectional. All of us. The ways that we experience disability varies by our gender, class, and race. The ways that we experience aging varies by our race, clan,
Mm.
class, and gender. The ways that we experience life varies by all of these things in which are a part of us. And we cannot live these lives that are separatist, right? So that's one of the arguments about like the mainstream feminist movement, is that it fails to take into account the ways in which racialization impacts women of color.
Yeah.
The experiences of white women are not the experiences of Black women. When white feminists were fighting to get into the workplace, Black women have been in the workplace.
Yeah.
There was not a time in which they weren't in the workplace. They were working when they were slaves. They might not have been compensated, but they were always working. And so, like, the struggles that we have are not the same struggles. White women are not being forcibly sterilized at rates that Indigenous and Black women are being sterilized without their knowledge and consent. Like, the issues that we have vary. And that's kind of why, for me, I find it important to make that distinction. Like, I am a Black feminist first and foremost. Like, my feminism is Black feminism. It's intersectional. It's thinking about the world and living and operating in a world, understanding that the ways that I am viewed and perceived are always going to be race, class, gendered, and
Mm.
sexualized. Always.
Absolutely. Because I'm quite interested in the argument about whether the different factions of feminism cause it to be divisive,
Yeah.
rather than a collective movement of women, well, anyone supporting gender equality actually working together,
Right.
rather than having these subsections. What do you think about that argument?
I think that that's an easy argument,
Yeah.
right? Like it's easy to call it divisive because wouldn't it just be easy if we could all just, be women?
Mm.
Of course it would be, but that's not the world that we live in. The fears that I have as a Black woman are not going to be the same fears that I would have if I were white,
Yeah.
or if I were wealthy, or if I were rural. Like, my experiences are different. I cannot speak for all Black women. I cannot speak for all women. And we shouldn't be able to do so. Like, there shouldn't be, like, because what then is the essential woman? Like, that's a question, right? And when we get to those kind of like politics about essentializing is when we have the actual division, as opposed to acknowledging the fact that we are all different.
Yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense. Thank you, Letisha. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, we're going to talk more about your research.
Lovely.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Letisha Brown. Letisha, in the first part, you talked about your research to do with Black women in sport. Would you like to talk us through one of your other pieces of research, please?
Yeah, so one of my other areas of interest is food and social relationships. The way that we eat is impacted by our lived experiences with others. And so my dissertation was all about eating together. I talked about how romantic relationships influence how and what we eat, talked about the workplace, and talked about, like, especially among African Americans, the role of religion and religious institutions in shaping food and that experience. I think it's food is one of those things that is so basic, right? But it doesn't seem to get as much of attention as other things within our society and in terms of research.
Tell us more about that, because you're right, that's a really kind of niche area, isn't it? It's not one of the areas you'd expect to see within sociology, the sociology of food, if you like. So,
Right. But then, like, why wouldn't it be? We all eat.
yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. Yeah. How did that get started, your research on that area then?
For me, I've always kind of been interested in food, but when I was at the University of Texas, I took a course in American Studies called American Food. And we did these oral history projects of iconic Texas restaurants. And I just fell in love with the notion of studying food in relation to people. And to kind of like hear these narrative stories, I thought it was the most interesting thing, and the way to kind of, make sure that my work wouldn't become pigeonholed. Like, I do consider myself to be a Black feminist scholar of sport, but I also study food. I study girlhood. I have these different areas, but of course, my goal is to someday find a way to build a project that connects all of these threads.
Yeah. And could you say a little bit more about the connection between religion and food?
Yes, I have a paper out right now in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health that is about Black men, masculinity, and food through the lens of religion, and thinking about religion as one of the core aspects of Black masculine identity. And it focuses specifically on more of a Christian narrative of religion, though, Black men are Muslim, Hindu, a variation of everything. But in this particular work, the interviews that I did, the majority of men either identified as Christian or as spiritual, as opposed to being tied to a particular denomination.
And so what the relationship with food was kind of cultural, is that right?
Yes, and just tied to their identities as Black men, and thinking about, for instance, the practice of fasting as a way of expressing their control over their lives. And like, in a society in which Black men are viewed as being out of control, and hence they're surveillanced and criminalized within the media, being able to do something like fasting shows that you're not a body in general, and you're not just a body out of control.
Yeah. I was just reading, eat to live, don't live to eat. Black men face food. Is
Yes,
that right? That's what they're,
that is me.
yeah. And you just mentioned black girlhoods as well. Could you say a little bit more about that for us, Letisha?
Yeah, so I'm going to be working on an autoethnography on Black girlhood from like a transnational perspective because, my mother is African, my father is American, and my childhood was shaped by both my African and American, Black American heritage, and really the foods that I ate, the sports that I was exposed to and played, and just thinking about how we talk a lot about girlhoods, but within the girlhood literature, it's just now growing that we're speaking specifically about Black girlhood, which matters in a world in which Black girls in general are becoming increasingly more criminalized. Like the largest growing criminal population is Black women now, and Black girls are getting expelled from schools at rates that are similar to those of Black boys. And it's time that we pay attention.
What's your theories behind why that's occurring, do you think, Letisha?
I mean, once again, it's these ideas that Black children don't really exist. If 12-year-old Tamir Rice was viewed as a man and murdered for having a toy gun, exactly when does Black childhood exist? Like, in the eyes of the media, there are no such thing as Black children. Black girls become women the minute their bodies begin to change. They're talked about as being fast. That's the term usually, and hypersexual. And it's like, no, they're just like the outfits that a Black girl wears, the hairstyles that a Black girl wears. When discussed in the media, it makes them seem more sexual than a white girl in the same. And the work that's being done in this area, I think, is incredibly important. Like the work of authors like Venus, Evan Winters. It's just, there's so much happening that we really just need to take a step back and kind of understand why we're still living in this world in which Blackness negates your chance to experience childhood.
Yeah. And it's come back to that same thing about sexualization again.
Yes.
And I'm still, trying to get my head right around that, why that occurs among Black females. When does that sort of process of the sexualization start and occur, and when does it start to be picked up in the media, do you think?
I mean, if you think about the history of the US and the ways that, Black people have operated in the US, because of these legacies of slavery in which we needed Black girls to be Black women such that we could use their bodies for reproductive purposes in order to build the economy. But we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about how these things are tied back to our colonial past because supposedly, since Obama, we're a post-racial society. Did you know the US? We're totally post-racial. And, even though Donald Trump has brought back stereotypes, not even brought back, but made space for the ways that people think and to be able to express it freely and loudly. Because it wasn't politically correct 4 years ago, but now, and even that terminology distresses me, like political correctness, as though human decency is something that is problematic. I don't know. I don't get it.
No, it doesn't make sense at all, does it? I
No.
remember someone, and excuse me, I can't remember who it was I interviewed, but they even talked about within pornography, for example, that black or ebony is kind of a niche kind of market. It's a subsection of pornography in itself, but you don't get the equivalent necessarily with other races.
Exactly. And it's just distressing. That's to say the least. It's very distressing. Like there are people that are doing like I know within the porn industry, like Jet Setting Jasmine and King Noir are doing these conversations on such issues about like how Black sexuality is exploited within the porn industry and just kind of focusing more on things like body positivity and healthy relationships. So there is work even in that area that's being done, which I find fascinating. It's not my area, but I am fascinated by a lot of things.
Yeah. Letisha, I always try and get some more positives out. So
Yeah.
I was really intrigued to see, since you've been doing your research, have you seen progress? I know what you've just said about Donald Trump. Maybe
Mhm.
we've gone backwards in the last 4 or 5 years, but
Mhm.
have you seen progress and developments in terms of racial relationships, stereotyping, and so on?
One of the things that I'm hopeful about, right, is hockey.
Hmm.
And the ways that even though hockey isn't a sport that's typically associated with people of color in general and Black people in particular, we have things like the Black Girl Hockey Club and work being done to kind of promote, hockey as a sport in which Black people are welcome. And that gives me some hope. And, the fact that we're taking the time to listen to people like Naomi Osaka and Maya Moore and kind of not getting as much attention as I think that they deserve, but at least getting some attention, right, in the work that they're doing towards social justice. I
Yeah.
think that there is a growing body of work being done by Black feminists of sports that we're hopefully going to see in the next few years. And hopefully there will be more change that is made. I want to be hopeful.
Yeah. It's the reason I ask is there's been a recent study in the UK about the commentary used describing football matches, or soccer matches, I should say.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And what they noticed was that the words to describe many Black players was always about their speed or their strength or
Hmm.
how powerful they were,
And
and
not
very.
intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. The idea of intelligence. And I have noticed a marked change. Now, it could be a forced change, but I have
Hmm.
noticed this movement to try and refer to more Black players as intelligent, for example. Now, as I said, it could be forced, but it feels like
It has to
maybe a bit
start
of progress.
somewhere.
Yeah, it does feel like there's hopefully a bit of progress there. I wondered if there was similar in the US.
Oh, very similar. Like there's often these conversations about why there aren't more Black quarterbacks. It's because this idea that the quarterback is the leader of the team and a force of intelligence, and Black players are enforcers and speed and animalistic and not necessarily higher functioning in terms of brain function, which is BS, right? But
Yeah.
like it's definitely the conversations that have been happening.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So maybe we are on some movement forward, even if it's slow steps. Maybe there is
Right.
progress. Yeah. And Letitia, could I ask you just to finish off? I always ask people to tell us more about how people can read more about your work or get in touch with you at all.
Yeah, so definitely be sure to check me out on Twitter, Letitia122. Also, my website, drletitiaecbrown.com, has information on my research, my teaching, and ways to contact me. I am working on a lot of projects that are going to be coming out in 2021, 2022. So be on the lookout for that. I'm really excited about things that I have in the pipeline.
Yeah, and I really like the sort of areas that you look into, and not just the sport one, but the food one as well. Very niche, very interesting area of sociology.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your time for this episode, Letitia, and thank you for chatting to me.
Happy to do so.
Thank you.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.